So before we start to talk about the energy flow through an ecosystem, we need to make several definitions first. And the first definition is that of the habitat. So this is the area or natural environment in which an organism lives, and it's made up of two components, abiotic factors, which are non-living factors in the habitat, as well as the biotic or living factors. Now, abiotic factors include soil pH, especially if we're going to talk about plants or microorganisms that live in the soil. We could talk about moisture in the environment or the habitat. We could talk about temperature and also light intensity, especially if we're going to talk about plants. So these are the abiotic non-living factors within that habitat. Now, biotic factors might include, for example, food availability, so food availability, as well as the presence of natural predators. So collectively, these different factors make up the living environment for that organism, called its habitat. Now, the second definition is that of a species. So a species is a group of similar organisms that have very similar characteristics that can interbreed to produce fertile offspring. And that means because the offspring are fertile, they themselves can also reproduce to make more fertile offspring. So it's important to include the word fertile offspring when we talk about a species. Now, an ecological niche is the role and position a particular species has within its environment. So, for example, if we talked about a certain species of bee, we know bees are insect pollinators of certain flowering plants. So bees, for example, can transfer the pollen from the anther of one flower on one plant to the stigma on a different flower of a different plant, which allows the flowering plant to then reproduce itself. So they have a certain role to play within that environment. So the niche can include different factors, such as how that organism reproduces, how it affects other organisms within the environment, and how it interacts with both biotic and abiotic factors. Now, a community is where we have several different populations of different species. So a single population would be a particular number of individuals of a particular species at a given time. So if we have several different populations of several different species, when these live in a particular environment and they all interact together, that would be called a community. Now, lastly, the ecosystem then. Well, this is a community of several different species that interact as a system with both the non-living components of the environment, so things like air, water, mineral ions in the soil, as well as the biotic components of that environment. So it's a living, interacting system of different species, both with each other and with the abiotic factors in that environment. Now, it's important to realize that the ecosystem, we know it's biotic and abiotic factors that are linked together, and that quite often is through the nutrient cycles, so the nitrogen and carbon cycle that we've talked about, and also the energy flow is highly linked between the different members of an ecosystem. So we can now start to talk about the flow of energy through an ecosystem. Now, we know all energy originates from the sun. Now, we know sun gives off solar radiation, but most of this solar radiation is actually either reflected by the ozone layer or absorbed by, for example, the clouds in the atmosphere. So only a small proportion of that solar energy actually reaches the producers, which are the plants on the surface of the earth. Now, most of the energy that actually reaches these plants is itself not going to be utilized in making glucose by photosynthesis. So, for example, a lot of the light that reaches the plants, it's not actually of the correct wavelength to be absorbed by the photosynthetic pigments. So we know, for example, if we put here chlorophyll, we'll put in chlorophyll A, which is the primary photosynthetic pigment, that absorbs red and blue light. And we know it reflects, we put here, reflects green light. So this part of the visible spectrum, the green light, will be reflected by these pigments, and therefore that light energy is not going to be used in making glucose. Now also some of the solar radiation that does reach the plant, it doesn't actually hit the photosynthetic pigments. So we know these pigments are predominantly in the leaves, so some of the light is actually going to either pass through in between the leaves, it might hit parts of the plant that don't photosynthesize, like the bark and the branches, etc. Now some of the energy that's in the solar radiation is also used to evaporate some of the water within the leaves themselves. So we know there's a thin film of water that surrounds the mesophyll cells within the leaves, and that water does evaporate into water vapor into the air chambers, which then moves out through the stomatal pores. So some of the light energy is actually used in transpiration. Now we know the light energy that does get absorbed by the plants by the different photosynthetic pigments is used to generate sugars like glucose, and these sugars are actually used to make other organic molecules like amino acids and therefore proteins, fatty acids and lipids within the plant itself. So some of that light energy is actually going to be fixed into organic molecules in the plant. Now the primary consumer is the herbivore. So on this picture we've got the giraffe here in the middle. Now we know herbivores do eat plant material, vegetation, so they're going to actually take in as holozoic feeders. So we know the giraffe is a holozoic feeder, and that means it's got an internal digestive system. So it's going to take in the organic material, it's going to break it down, and it's then going to absorb many of these molecules into its blood, and these get absorbed by the cells of the giraffe. Things like amino acids and glucose, etc., fatty acids, lipids, and they get used into building biomass. However, it's not 100%, so it's not 100% energy transfer between the plants and the primary consumer, the herbivore, and that's because not all of the plant gets consumed. So for example, when this giraffe comes along, it does tend to eat the leaves, so it's going to eat predominantly the leaves off the plant, that vegetation. It doesn't eat the bark, it doesn't eat the branches, and it certainly doesn't eat the root system of the plant. So not all of the energy wrapped up in the plant's biomass gets transferred into the herbivore. Now we also need to recognize that a lot of plant material contains cellulose. Now while herbivores are very good at digesting and breaking down cellulose to absorb the glucose from that, not all of the cellulose will be digested. Some of it will be egested in the feces of the giraffe, and therefore this contributes to the lack of energy transfer from producer to primary consumer. Now when we look at an animal, and in this picture we've got the lion, this is going to be what we call a secondary consumer. So this will come along and it will eat predominantly herbivores, so gazelles, whatever it may be, giraffes, etc. And they eat predominantly meat tissue, which is largely protein based. Now we know all the energy in the biomass of the giraffe, that is not going to be transferred into the lion, and that's because a lot of the energy that is consumed by the giraffe, for example, will be egested out. That's the cellulose. We know that's not eaten by the secondary consumer, the lion. We know not all parts of the giraffe are going to be eaten by the lion necessarily, and we know as well as egested cellulose and fiber, the giraffe in this case, it will excrete certain molecules like urea, which are not going to be utilized by the secondary consumer. So again, there's a loss of energy from the herbivore, the primary consumer, to the secondary consumer, which is the lion in this case. Now we know that any living organism at some point will die, and this includes plants, primary consumers and secondary consumers, and that organic material wrapped up in the dead plants or the dead animals, it's going to be decomposed by what we call saprophytic organisms. So detritus is non-living organic matter, for example feces, fallen leaves, excreted products like urea, as well as these dead organisms, this dead organic matter. And all of these different factors get decomposed by saprophytes. And we know saprophytes include bacteria. So we can say here bacteria and fungi. And we know they have extracellular digestion, where they secrete digestive enzymes to the outside environment. These digestive enzymes break down this organic material that we find in feces, fallen leaves, excretory products, and dead organisms. The saprophytes then do break down products of digestion like amino acids and glucose and fatty acids, and they can utilize those. So there's going to be a flow of energy into the decomposers. One other organism we need to talk about are those that we can describe as detritivores. Now, this detritus, this non-living organic matter like fallen leaves, feces, dead organisms, they can start to be broken down also by holozoic organisms like dung beetles, earthworms, etc. And they're holozoic because they take in the dead organic detritus and they break it down internally inside an internal digestive system. So we need to be able to use this definition of trophic level, and it's really when we've got a group of organisms within an ecosystem which occupy the same level within a particular food chain. So we know food chains are made up of several different trophic levels. The first trophic level being the producers that absorb sunlight, and they use the light energy and they kind of convert this to chemical energy in the form of glucose by photosynthesis. So these are the plants. We then know the second trophic level, for example, the primary consumer is normally a herbivore which eats the plant material. We know there's not 100% transfer of energy from the first to the second trophic level because not all parts of the plant are eaten, for example, the bark, for example, the root systems, etc. So some of the biomass in the plant material, that energy is not transferred to the herbivore. Cellulose, for example, not all of it gets digested. Now, when we've got the second trophic level, again, there's going to be a lot of energy between that second trophic level and the third trophic level, which involves a group of, for example, lions, the secondary consumers. And that's because within the giraffe, we know some of the organic material will be excreted, for example, urea. We know the giraffe that takes in predominantly cellulose, well, not all the cellulose is broken down and digested, so some of that gets released through egestion, so that's not available to the next trophic level. We know also that the giraffe, when it absorbs glucose into its cells, that glucose is respired, and when the glucose is respired inside cells of the giraffe, a lot of the energy is actually released back to the environment as heat energy. So again, that is not available to the next trophic level. So there's going to be a loss of energy between these different trophic levels. So a very common exam question actually asks, why do we think a food chain is quite often limited to only 5 trophic levels? Well, we know there's going to be energy release between the different trophic levels. So this energy is lost predominantly as heat energy because, for example, glucose inside the cells, when it gets respired through cellular respiration, some energy is lost back to the environment as heat. We know urea, for example, is a chemical that's a waste product from cells that has to be removed from certain organisms, mammals, for example. So that contains some chemical energy that's also lost to the environment. And we know egested material, feces, will contain a lot of cellulose, which is not broken down and not used by that organism. So this energy wrapped up in the cellulose is also lost from that particular trophic level and is not available to the next trophic level. So quite often we will get up to 5 trophic levels within a food chain. Some of the exceptions will be, for example, in deep sea ecosystems, and that's because rather than about 10% energy transfer between the trophic level, we can have up to 40% energy transfer between some of the trophic levels. And we'll see why a little bit shortly. So we need to be able to use certain calculations in this topic, And the first calculation that we're going to use is called photosynthetic efficiency. Now this is a measure of how much light that falls on a leaf is actually going to be utilized and converted into chemical energy in the form of glucose. So we know not all of the light energy that hits a leaf will actually be utilized in photosynthesis. Now, solar radiation, we know, contains several different types of wavelengths. Now, only a small part of the electromagnetic spectrum, called the visible spectrum, is going to be involved in photosynthesis. So about 60% of the sun's output is outside the visible range within the electromagnetic spectrum. So if we have a look at the electromagnetic spectrum in this picture, only a small part of it is the visible light of the different colors. Now, the different photosynthetic pigments absorb different wavelengths of light optimally. So if we start with chlorophyll A, which is the primary photosynthetic pigment, we can see on this graph, which is called the absorption spectrum. So I'll put here absorption spectrum. This shows us the amount of light energy being absorbed by the different pigments at the different wavelengths within the visible spectrum. So it's the amount of light energy. So amount of light energy being absorbed by the different pigments at the different wavelengths. Now if we look at chlorophyll A, we can see that most of the light energy is being absorbed in the blue part of the visible spectrum here. So we can see here there's actually a lot of light energy being absorbed within this 400 to 450 nanometer range. We can also see with chlorophyll A, within the red part of the visible spectrum, a lot of light energy is being absorbed. So we know chlorophyll A, which is the primary photosynthetic pigment, absorbs predominantly the blue light and the red light from the visible light that hits the leaf. So all of the light energy in the solar radiation that falls outside of the visible spectrum is not going to be utilized by the plant, and only the red and the blue light as part of the visible spectrum is going to be absorbed. Now we can see the amount of light being absorbed in the green part of the visible spectrum, so I'll do this down here, is actually very, very low. So we know green light is actually reflected by all of the photosynthetic pigments. Now chlorophyll B is what we call an accessory pigment, so I'll label that here, chlorophyll B, and that absorbs predominantly light energy in the blue part of the visible spectrum. So this light green line on the graph is the amount of light being absorbed by chlorophyll B, and we can see that is highest in the blue part of the visible spectrum. Chlorophyll B does not really reflect green and yellow lights. It doesn't absorb green and yellow light, it does reflect it, but it does absorb a little bit of red light. And that's going to be passed to chlorophyll A and used in photosynthesis. So most of the light energy is not actually suitable and it's not absorbed by the pigments. We know some of the energy in the solar radiation will actually be utilized to transpire water, to evaporate water into the air chambers inside the leaf as water vapor, which is transpired out of the leaf. We know some of the light energy actually passes through the leaf, so it gets transmitted through the leaf and it's not absorbed by the pigments. So photosynthetic efficiency, we can actually write down an equation for this. So this equation is given by the energy incorporated into photosynthetic products such as glucose, which is the primary sugar produced from photosynthesis, and we know that's used by the plant to make other organic molecules like amino acids, proteins, fatty acids, and therefore lipids. So it's the total energy incorporated into the product of photosynthesis divided by the total light energy that falls on the plant itself. Now this is a percentage, so we times that by 100 and we're going to get a value less than 100%, because we know not all of the energy that hits the plant is going to be utilized in photosynthesis. And we know the reasons for that. So the wrong wavelengths of light to be absorbed by the pigments, like green light is reflected, and light outside the visible spectrum, like X-rays and infrared light, is obviously not going to be used either. We know some light is transmitted through the leaf. Some light does not fall on the photosynthetic pigments. For example, it might fall on the bark, which we know does not photosynthesize. And we know energy from sunlight is also used to evaporate water into water vapor inside the air chambers, and that energy is therefore not going to be used in making chemical energy. So the next idea we need to talk about is called gross primary productivity, or GPP. Now this is the rate at which light energy being absorbed by the photosynthetic pigments is actually converted into chemical energy in the form of organic molecules like glucose. Now we know glucose is the molecule synthesized from photosynthesis, and it's also used then to make other organic molecules in the plant like amino acids and fatty acids, etc. So the rate of conversion of light energy into chemical energy in the form of glucose is called GPP. Now the units are very important, and the units are kilojoules of energy per meter squared per year. So you always have to give these in the exam question. Now the next idea is called net primary productivity, or NPP. Now we know all the glucose being made by the plants, the GPP, some of that glucose will be distributed to all the cells of the plant and absorbed by the cells and respired through cellular respiration. Now we know cellular respiration releases some of the energy wrapped up in the glucose in the form of ATP, but it also releases some of the energy as heat energy back into the environment. So the glucose produced by the plant as GPP, some of that glucose will be respired by all the cells of the plant, so some of the energy is lost back to the environment as heat energy. Now, of the chemical energy that exists in the plant after the glucose has been respired, so the glucose that might be stored as starch, or the glucose that's used to make amino acids or fatty acids that go to make new cells, that is called the NPP, and it's the biomass of the organic material within that plant that is available to the next trophic level. So the herbivore that comes along and eats the plant, the NPP, the net primary productivity, is the level of organic material, chemical energy available to that plant after we've taken into account the glucose that has been used up in respiration by the cells of the plant. So in the picture at the bottom, we can see the energy that hits the plant. 0.8% of this energy is captured by photosynthesis and converted to glucose. Of the energy, the GPP within that plant, 55% of the glucose might be used up in cellular respiration and so lost as heat to the environment. 45% of the glucose might be used to make other organic molecules, and it might end up as a biomass within the actual plant material itself, and it's this NPP that is available to the next trophic level, which would be the herbivores, for example, or omnivores also. So we can use this equation to allow us to calculate NPP, and we know NPP is GPP, which is gross primary productivity, minus the glucose used up in cellular respiration, of which a lot of the energy is released to the environment as heat energy. So NPP is basically the biomass in the organic molecules that's left over after respiration has been taken into account. So for example, the chemical energy in starch, in lipids within the plant material, within amino acids and proteins, and it's this that's available to the next trophic level. We know GPP is the rate at which light energy is being absorbed and converted to chemical energy in glucose. So this is the first equation that we talked about on the previous slide. NPP is the GPP minus the glucose used up in cellular respiration, of which some of that energy is released to the environment as heat. So in this particular exam question, it asks us to explain what's meant by the term gross primary productivity, or GPP. Now we know GPP really is the rate of photosynthesis, so it's the rate of absorption of light energy and its conversion into chemical energy in the form of glucose, which is the main photosynthate. So if we look at the answer, it says the rate of conversion of light energy into chemical energy in the form of glucose by producers via photosynthesis. Now the next question, it says it's been found that an increase in temperature has a greater effect on the rate of respiration in a plant than on the rate of photosynthesis. So let's just jot down what this says. It says increased temperature in this particular plant increases or has a greater effect on the rate of respiration above that of photosynthesis. So we increase the temperature, we increase the rate of respiration above that of the rate of photosynthesis. Now it says, using this info, explain what effect an increase in temperature has on the net primary productivity. So we know NPP equals GPP, which is the gross primary productivity, minus the rate of respiration. So when we increase temperature, we increase the rate of respiration above that of photosynthesis. So this value here is going to increase, and this value here is going to relatively be less. So what's this effect going to have on NPP? Well, if GPP goes down and respiration rate goes up, that means the NPP must become lower, because more glucose is being used up in cellular respiration, and therefore the net overall NPP is going to decrease. So let's have a quick look at the answer. So the net primary productivity decreases because more glucose is being used up through cellular respiration and broken down than is being made by photosynthesis, which is equivalent really to GPP. Now the reason for this, if you've done the respiration and photosynthesis topic, is that we know respiration, cellular respiration, involves a host of different enzyme catalyzed reactions, and there's many more enzyme reactions involved in respiration than in photosynthesis. So if we increase the temperature, we know we increase the rate of reaction, and if there's more enzyme catalyzed reactions, the rate of respiration overall is going to be increased because of the increased kinetic energy. So the enzymes move faster and the substrates move faster. There's more successful collisions between the substrate and the active site of the enzyme. There's more ES complexes and reaction rate increases. So we can start to look at an exam question, and this one is an AO2 style question, and that means we're going to apply the knowledge that we have of energy transfer in an ecosystem to a scenario that we might not be familiar with. Now we can see the diagram on the right hand side, and it gives us certain values of energy, and they're always in kilojoules per meter squared per year. So these values represent energy as kilojoules per meter squared per year, and we can see the different trophic levels. Now the question says the energy flow in kilojoules per meter squared per year through the community of different species of populations in one area of the English Channel. And question A says 0.5% of the energy at the sea surface is fixed by phytoplankton. Now you might not have heard of phytoplankton before, but we know if they photosynthesize, they must be producers, so they're the first trophic level that's going to fix light energy into chemical energy. Now actually phytoplankton are algae, and we know algae are unicellular organisms that can photosynthesize. They are eukaryotic, and that means they've got membrane-bound organelles. So we can see top left in this picture, this is a simplified picture of an algae cell. So it's a unicellular organism. It's got two flagella that allow it to kind of move to an extent. It has mitochondria, which allow it to generate ATP through aerobic respiration. It has a nucleus, and that contains the genetic material, which is the genetic code that allows protein synthesis. And also it has this quite unique cup-shaped green chloroplast. Now within the chloroplast we know there's thylakoid discs, and a stack of thylakoid discs is called a granum. So we can see many grana within this chloroplast. Now the photosynthetic pigments like chlorophyll A and B, etc., they're located in the thylakoid membranes within the chloroplast, and it's those pigments that absorb red and blue light and convert the light energy essentially into chemical energy in the form of glucose. So the glucose is made inside the chloroplast in the fluid, the stroma, outside the thylakoid discs. Now you can't see these unicellular organisms by eye because they are microscopic, but quite often in the oceans and the seas we can see what's called an algal bloom, where we've got many millions of these algae that reproduce. Now we also get algal blooms inland, in freshwater ponds and lakes, and quite often if we get eutrophication, which is part of the nitrogen cycle, we can see the formation of algal blooms as well. So we know the producer in this particular exam question is the algae. So if we start off with a diagram at the top, we can see 1.26 times 10 to the power 6 kilojoules per meter squared per year of energy. And that energy, some of it is going to be fixed by the algae, because we know they are the producers that can photosynthesize. So within these producer organisms, the phytoplankton or the algae, 6,300 kilojoules per meter squared per year of energy is fixed as biomass. And we know this is going to be GPP. So all the organic molecules within that algae as a result of photosynthesis is called gross primary productivity, or GPP. Now if we use our first equation that we learned, and it's called photosynthetic efficiency, so efficiency, and we know this is the light energy that is absorbed and utilized in photosynthesis divided by the total light energy that hits the phytoplankton times 100, because it is a percentage, and we know it's always going to be less than 100%. So we can actually work this out. We know the total light energy being converted to chemical energy is 6,300 divided by the total solar energy is 1.26 times 10 to the power 6 times 100, and that gives us 0.5%, as it states over here in the question on the left. So we know 99.5% of the solar radiation is actually lost to the environment, and we know this is predominantly because a lot of the solar radiation falls outside the visible spectrum, and that's not going to be used at all in photosynthesis. We also know within the visible spectrum, red and blue light is absorbed by the photosynthetic pigments and converted to chemical energy, but the green light within the visible spectrum is reflected by these photosynthetic pigments, so that green light is also not going to be utilized in photosynthesis. Now we also know, because the algae sit just under the surface of the sea, a lot of the solar radiation might be reflected from the sea surface, and also some of the solar radiation might not even hit the photosynthetic pigments within the algae, so they might be transmitted straight through the algae. So we know not all of the solar radiation is used, only a small proportion, which is 0.5%. Now the next question says, question B, calculate the net primary productivity, NPP. Well, we know NPP, net primary productivity, is related to the producers, and you can only get NPP in organisms that are autotrophic, that can either photosynthesize like the algae or chemosynthesize. So we know NPP is, if we just write the equation down, NPP equals GPP from the producer minus the glucose used up in respiration, and some of the energy is lost as heat energy to the environment. So we can see here the algae do respire, because every living organism has to use glucose, and it respires the glucose. So if we go 6,300 minus, So 6,300 is GPP minus 1,260 as the energy used up in respiration, or the glucose used up in respiration, and that will give us a value of 5,040 kilojoules per meter squared per year. So the NPP from the algae available to the next trophic level is 5040, and that's really as biomass, so the organic molecules that make up the actual structures within the cells of the algae. Now, if we look at the picture on the right hand side, we can see 1008 kilojoules of energy is uneaten phytoplankton. So these algae, they fall to the sea or sink to the seabed, and they're going to obviously die. So as they fall away from the surface of the sea, because of the lack of light energy, they can't photosynthesize, so they end up just dying off and they sink to the seabed. And we know any dead organism will be decomposed by saprophytic bacteria and fungi. So of this 5,040 kilojoules of energy as NPP in the algae, 1,008 is not available to the next trophic level because that is going to be decomposed by the decomposer organisms. So this next value here, 4,032 kilojoules per meter squared per year, is the energy that's eaten by the next level, trophic level, the herbivores. Now the herbivores that eat the algae are called zooplankton, and these are microscopic animals, marine animals, and they're very, very small, and they do swim to a certain extent, but not very much, and they can feed off the algae. So they're going to take in 4,032 kilojoules of energy. Now we know these herbivores, these microscopic herbivores, because they do move a little bit and they also respire, some of the energy that they take in will be lost through respiration and movement. So some of that glucose they take in is respired, and some energy is lost as heat energy, and some energy is used in movement in the form of ATP. So we've got 4,032, 2,822 is lost through respiration and movement. Now, of the energy that remains, 93 kilojoules of energy is wrapped up within these dead herbivores, so these dead zooplankton organisms. So they're going to also be decomposed by our saprophytic bacteria or fungi within this environment, this ecosystem. Now, 403 kilojoules of energy is egested by these zooplankton herbivores. So this is chemical energy lost through egested material that can't be broken down, digested, and therefore utilized. So that's going to be lost. And that means that the energy available to the next trophic level is 4,032 minus 2,822 minus 403 minus 93, because obviously the dead zooplankton, the dead herbivores, are not going to be consumed by the next trophic level. So the energy taken in by the next trophic level, which might be crustaceans, for example, because they feed off zooplankton. So we can put here crustaceans. So they're animals that feed off zooplankton. They take in 714 kilojoules per meter squared per year. Now, of these crustaceans, 71 kilojoules is egested material, so that chemical energy is not going to be used to build biomass because it's kind of released from the organisms. Energy used up as glucose through respiration is 572. So again, this might be glucose that is respired inside all the cells of the crustaceans. So that's now not available to the next trophic level. So the next carnivore, the high level carnivore, comes along and eats the crustacean. So this might be fish, for example, small fish. So the energy available to the fish is 714 minus glucose used up in respiration minus the ingested material, and that will leave us with that 71 kilojoules here. So that's a basic breakdown of the different processes. Now we can start to answer the questions. So question A, reflection of solar energy at the sea surface. Some of the solar energy will be transmitted through the algae, through the phytoplankton, because it doesn't hit the pigments. So that was this answer down here. And we know some of the light is not of the correct wavelength to be absorbed by the photosynthetic pigments, so it gets reflected, in particular green light, as part of the visible spectrum. Now, question B1 is the NPP. So we know NPP refers to the producers, the algae, and that must be 5,040 kilojoules per meter squared per year. Remember, you must put in the units to get the full marks. And lastly, the total energy available to decomposers. Well, we've kind of seen this already, so I'll do this in yellow. So of the algae, 1,008 kilojoules per meter squared per year of energy is available to decomposers, because these algae die off and sink to the seabed. Of the zooplankton, so the zooplankton are the next trophic level that consume the algae. So these are the primary consumers. So we can put here primary consumer. 93 kilojoules of energy is dead uneaten zooplankton, so that'll be decomposed. We know the ingested material by the zooplankton can also be decomposed. So that's 93 and 403. Now, of the crustaceans, the next trophic level, they must be the secondary consumers. Here. So 71 kilojoules is ingested, which is therefore available for decomposition. So we're going to add 1,008 with 93 with 403 with 71. And that gives us 1,575 kilojoules per meter squared per year available to decomposers. Because it's not just dead organic material in the form of organisms that once were living, it's also the ingested organic material or excreted organic material as well. So the next equation that we need to know about is called gross ecological efficiency. And this is quite simply the amount of energy that is transferred from one trophic level to the next trophic level. And we know it's always going to be less than 100%. So the equation is the energy within one trophic level divided by the total energy in the previous trophic level in that food chain times 100%. So this example down here at the bottom of the slide, we can see the gross ecological efficiency for the primary consumer. So the primary consumer is going to be, the primary consumer must be the grasshopper, because that's feeding off the plant material in this flower. So we can see here the primary consumer is a grasshopper. The trophic level has 1,213 joules of energy. We know the primary producer, which was the plant, which has the flowers, was 16,580 joules. So we just put these into the equation above, and that will give us 7.3% ecological efficiency. So 7.3% of the energy in the producer, this flowering plant, is transferred to the next trophic level, the primary consumer, which is this herbivore, it's this insect that feeds off the plant. So the gross ecological efficiency will vary depending on the food chain and the environment. So on the left hand side here, we've got a food web which shows the feeding relationships between different organisms in this aquatic ecosystem. Now, quite often in an aquatic ecosystem or oceanic ecosystem, we will see more energy is actually transferred from one trophic level to the next. So it might not be 10%, it might be nearer, say, 40% in some cases, energy gets transferred from one trophic level to the next. Now, because more energy is being transferred through the food chain or the food web, it can sustain more trophic levels within this particular feeding relationship. Now, if we look at a terrestrial ecosystem that might involve mammals and birds, for example, now because the ecological efficiency is less for these types of food chains or food webs, so it's going to be nearer sort of 10%, or in some cases even below 10%, less energy is being transferred between each trophic level. So these are going to be limited in terms of the number of trophic levels that can be sustained, and it's going to be nearer to the 5 trophic levels that we've mentioned already. Quite often in an oceanic food chain or food web, they're going to have more than 5 trophic levels because more energy is being moved from one trophic level to the next. Now, the reason for this is really because most aquatic organisms like fish and invertebrates in this food web on the left hand side, they're ectothermic, and that means they don't regulate their body temperature through the release of heat energy through respiration, but their body temperature is very similar to that of the surrounding water, so the ambient temperature of the surrounding water. So it means they actually have a lower respiration rate because they don't need to release energy through respiration as heat energy to maintain that core body temperature. So if they've got a lower respiration rate, it means more of the energy in the food that they consume can go toward building biomass. So there's more energy trapped in these organisms that's available to the next trophic level. Now, if we look at the terrestrial ecosystem on the right-hand side, this food web here, we know mammals and birds are endothermic, and that means they have to maintain a core body temperature at a set value irrespective of the outside temperature. So for example, if they need to increase their core body temperature, the rate of respiration might increase, and that releases some heat energy that's transferred around the animal through its bloodstream. Increased respiration means more glucose has to be respired inside the cells by cellular respiration, so more heat energy is released. And if they use up more glucose from the food they eat, less chemical energy can be used to build biomass. So this energy transfer is going to be lower because there's less chemical energy in the biomass. It's going to be about 10% or lower. So the number of trophic levels here is going to be limited somewhat in a terrestrial ecosystem. Now we need to talk about the difference between primary and secondary production. So we've already talked a little bit about primary production as GPP, or gross primary productivity, and we know this is the conversion of energy into biomass or new organic material inside the cells and the tissues of that producer. So we can see in the diagram here, top left, these organisms, plants, we know they photosynthesize, as do the algae. We know algae are unicellular eukaryotic organisms, so these photosynthesize. Many bacteria can also photosynthesize, as well as chemosynthesize. So chemosynthesis is the utilization of energy released from chemical reactions inside the cell or cells, and its conversion into chemical energy in the form of glucose or amino acids. Now, secondary productivity is the production of new organic matter, so these organic molecules like amino acids and proteins and etc., carbohydrates or more complex carbohydrates in consumers. So we know consumers cannot synthesize their own complex organic matter like the autotrophs can. They have to consume it in their diet, and when they do so, they're going to utilize some of that chemical energy to make new matter, new cells and new tissues. So this is the accumulation of new cells, new tissues or biomass in consumers. And we can see from the picture, we know all animals are consumers, so they have to take in ready-made organic complex material. We know fungi as well are saprophytes, so they cannot, they're not autotrophs, they cannot chemosynthesize, they cannot photosynthesize, and they have to take in these molecules like glucose and amino acids through saprophytic nutrition. And we know many bacteria are very similar, so they're also going to be saprophytes. But these are still consumers, and therefore they have what's called secondary productivity, the formation of new biomass. So one typical exam question is why do carnivores have a more efficient energy conversion compared to herbivores in terms of the food that they consume and how much of that food, the chemical energy in the food, is used to build biomass? Well, if we look at the carnivore, this female lion on the left hand side, we know the diet is predominantly meat tissue, and meat tissue comes from muscle, and inside the muscle cells we know there's a lot of protein. So the meal that the lion consumes contains a very, very high proportion of protein. Now we know in the stomach of the lion that protein is going to be hydrolyzed, it can start to be digested. As it passes through the duodenum and then the ileum, we know the protein has its final digestion there to amino acids, and these amino acids are absorbed into the blood of the carnivore, and a large proportion of them will be utilized inside the cells of that carnivore to build biomass, new cells, new tissues. So because protein is easy to digest in comparison to plant material, a large proportion of the food that's taken in is going to be utilized by the carnivore itself. Now the herbivore, on the other hand, such as the giraffe here, which is a non-ruminant organism, we know cows, for example, are ruminant organisms, but both types of herbivore, when they ingest cellulose, they do have cellulase secreting bacteria that can start to break down the cellulose into glucose monomers that they can then absorb. However, not all of the cellulose gets digested, so a lot of that organic material that's consumed in the diet of the herbivore actually passes out in the feces. So it's a much less efficient energy conversion in comparison to the carnivore on the left hand side. So protein in the carnivore diet is much more readily hydrolyzed and broken down and therefore digested compared to the cellulose of the herbivore diet. So a large proportion of the cellulose does pass through the digestive system of the herbivore, and it's actually lost through egestion as feces. So not all of that chemical energy will be utilized. Now the second type of question is, why would farmers keep animals in warm barns during the winter? Well, we know the winter is cooler temperatures compared to maybe the summer months. So if the cows that would normally be outside in the summer are brought into the barn during the winter months, it means that they don't have to work quite as hard to regulate the core body temperature. So if they were left out on the fields during the winter, they would have to have an increased rate of metabolism or respiration to release more heat energy that's carried around the inside of the cow to maintain a core body temperature. Because we know cows are endothermic, so they have to maintain a stable core body temperature. So in warmer conditions inside the barn, there's less cellular respiration compared to that would occur outside in the cold conditions. So less of the glucose is being used in cellular respiration, so more of that chemical energy can be used to build biomass. And it's the same sort of idea when we talk about caged hens, caged chickens. So we can keep these in cages, and that prevents them moving around too much. So because they're not going to move around too much, less of the food they consume is going to be used in cellular respiration to release that energy that would bring about muscle contraction. So more of the chemical energy that they consume is used to build biomass. So we get chickens, hens that are have more tissue. So this is the answer that we're going to put down. They will not have to use as much energy maintaining core body temperature when they're put in warm barns during the winter months. So more of the energy is available to produce biomass, cells and tissues. Now we know all energy originates from the sun as solar radiation. So we put here solar radiation. So we can start to annotate this picture now. Now we know organism A must be primary producer, and we know producers fix energy in sunlight in the form of chemical energy in glucose or organic molecules. So this might be, for example, plants. Now, of the solar radiation that hits the primary producers, we know not all of it will be utilized in photosynthesis. So some of the light might be reflected by different parts of the plant. Some of the light is definitely not going to be of the correct wavelength to be absorbed by the chlorophyll A and B, the photosynthetic pigments. So we know green light, for example, is reflected by these pigments in the leaves. Some light might be transmitted directly through the leaf. It might not hit the photosynthetic pigments. Some light might actually hit parts of the plant that do not photosynthesize, like the branches and the bark, etc. We also know that sunlight is made up of not just the visible spectrum, but the other wavelengths of light in the electromagnetic spectrum that we know are not suitable for photosynthesis. Now, the next annotation we're going to make is, well, we know any organism, and that includes plants and animals, they respire. So the glucose that the plants make is used by all the cells of that plant in cellular respiration, and energy when the glucose is respired is lost, some of it anyway, as heat energy through to the environment. So of the primary productivity here for A, 26,532 kilojoules per meter squared per year of energy is lost to the environment as heat. Now, this arrow at the bottom we know must indicate death. So all plants at some point will die, and when they do die, we know they're decomposed by saprophytic bacteria and fungi. Now we know B must be a primary consumer. So this might be, for example, herbivore. We'll put herbivore here. It could be an omnivore as well, we know that. Now we know the secondary consumer is going to consume the herbivore. So this might be an omnivore or a carnivore. So here we'll put carnivore. And lastly, the next trophic level might be a tertiary consumer. So this might be what we call a top carnivore that feeds predominantly off other carnivores. Now we know if we look at B, the primary consumer, again, all the cells of this organism respire. So the glucose that is broken down inside the cells will be converted the energy to ATP, but some of the energy is lost as heat to the surroundings. Now we know herbivores, for example, not all of the food they eat will be digested and absorbed. So some of the cellulose, for example, the fiber, will be lost as feces, so it's egested. We know some chemicals are excreted, like urine, for example, that contains urea. And we know some of these organisms are obviously going to die and therefore be decomposed. And this goes for the secondary consumer and the tertiary consumer as well. So we can start to look at an exam question here. Now, there's three letters. There's R, E, and C. And it says in the key that R represents respiratory loss. So this is the glucose that's used in cellular respiration, and the energy that's not conserved in ATP is going to be lost as heat energy to the surroundings. C represents the energy that is consumed by the next trophic level, and E indicates the expelled energy from decomposition of dead organisms, any feces that's digested that also gets decomposed, and any excreted molecules that will be decomposed as well. So the first question, A1, says calculate the respiratory loss by the herbivores and then the top carnivores. So we're going to work out what this R2 value must be to start with. So the herbivore here, okay, this organism that eats plant material and vegetation, is going to consume 20,227 kilojoules per meter squared per year of energy. Now, the expelled energy, death, decomposition, egested material is decomposed, and excreted molecules are decomposed, is 3,732. So we want to work out this value at the top here. Well, it says here 919 units of energy is available to the carnivore. So this must be the biomass within the herbivore. So the herbivore takes in 20,227 units of energy. 919 is available to the next trophic level. we know that must equal this calculation. So we're going to do 20,227 minus 919. And that value, we can then take away this 3,732, which is lost as expelled energy. And that will give us this value at the top, 15,576 kilojoules per meter squared per year. Now, it then says the top carnivore here at the end. So again, the energy that's being consumed by the top carnivore is 51 units of energy. Now, because this is the top carnivore, this is not eaten. So it's not eaten by any predators. It's not predated upon. So 51 units, well, we know 20 units is lost through expelled energy, through death, egested material, or excreted material. So that must mean the R4 value at the top is quite simply 51 minus 20. So this here will give us 31 units of energy. And again, always put in the units, kilojoules per meter squared per year. So they're the two answers there. Now, question A number 2 says, give the equation. There we go. Give the equation that expresses the energy flow through the carnivores. So in the middle here, we've got the carnivore. So the energy flow through it. So the energy that's being consumed by the carnivore is represented by C2. And the energy in the biomass of the carnivore that's available to the top carnivore is represented by C3. So what's the equation we're going to use here? Well, C3 is the energy in biomass in the carnivore available to the top carnivore. But the energy taken in is C2. So C3 here, C3 must equal C2 minus the energy that's not used to build biomass, which would be R3 plus E3. So this is our answer here. C3 is C2, the energy that's consumed by the carnivore, minus the energy lost as heat through respiration, and also any chemical energy that's either egested, excreted, or lost through death. Now, question B, the values given are for a small wood are in kilojoules per meter squared per year. The area of the wood is 25,000 meters squared. Calculate the total amount of energy expelled by this ecosystem in 1 year. So the values that were given on the diagram, the units are kilojoules per meter squared per year. And it does say the energy expelled by the ecosystem in 1 year. Well, all we have to do quite simply is times the values E1 plus E2 plus E3 plus E4. So we have to add these together and then times them by 25,000 meters squared, because we know the values given here above are per meter squared. So the area of the wood is 25,000 meters squared. So the maths is 25,000 meters squared times E1 plus E2 plus E3 plus E4. So the answer we're going to get is, let's have a look at this, 120,850,000 kilojoules per 25,000 meters squared per year, which is the value down here at the bottom. Okay. Then it says, describe what happens to this expelled energy. Well, we know the expelled energy, it gives us this up in the key at the top right here, is any dead organisms must be decomposed by saprophytes that are organisms like bacteria and fungi that secrete enzymes that have extracellular digestion. We know the feces contains fiber, for example, that is not digested by the herbivore, the carnivore. So that's also going to be decomposed, as well as any excreted products like urea that's contained within the urine. So here we go. The energy is passed to decomposers for decomposition. And we could also put in there detritivores as well, because they do help to break down and decompose dead organic matter. The glucose then is respired by the decomposers, these bacteria and fungi, and so some of the energy that ends up within the decomposer is also lost as heat energy to the environment, because we know decomposers also have to undergo respiration to release the energy in the glucose that they consume. So this type of question is what we call an application question. So it's an AO2 type question, and it's where we have to apply the knowledge that we have and kind of figure out a reasonable answer. So the first question, A, says calculate the figures for respiration by plants in the alfalfa field and the NPP, so net primary productivity, of the young pine forest. So we're given 3 different areas of the world, so Puerto Rico, USA and England. So we could call them sort of 1, 2 and 3 if you like. Put 1, 2 and 3. And it gives us the GPP here at the top. It then gives us the rate of respiration by these plants, and then NPP. So we can fairly simply put in the values here, because we know NPP, so net primary productivity, is the energy in the organic matter in the cells and tissues of the plant, otherwise known as biomass, and that equals the GPP, so the rate of conversion of light energy into chemical energy by photosynthesis, minus the glucose used up in respiration. So some of this glucose that's being made by photosynthesis, GPP, is used up in respiration, cellular respiration, and a little bit of energy is released to the environment as heat energy. We know that. So we can use this equation and then we can pop in the values here. So we're going to find that the NPP for the young pine forest in England at the bottom here is 31,000 kilojoules per meter squared per year, because that equals the GPP 51,000 minus respiration 20,000, which will give you this figure here. Now if you want to work out the rate of respiration, well, quite simply we can go we can put in a different equation, or we can utilize the equation we've got, but we can rearrange it. So respiration is going to equal GPP minus NPP. So you're just rearranging the equation. So here, respiration in the alfalfa crops in the USA, respiration equals GPP, so 102,000 minus NPP, which is 64,000, which gives you your 38,000 kilojoules per meter squared per year. Now the next question says how much energy is available to the primary consumers in the rainforest. So a primary consumer is any organism that feeds off plant material, because the primary producer is the plant itself. So in the rainforest, so we're going to use this column on the left hand side here. So we know NPP is the biomass in these rainforest trees and plants available to the primary consumer. So it must be 54,000 kilojoules per meter squared per year, because NPP is the biomass available to the next trophic level. Now question C, so we've done A, B, now we're on question C, suggests why the GPP of a rainforest is so much greater than that of the pine forest. So the GPP of the rainforest is going to be much greater than that of the pine forest. Well, gross primary productivity is really how much light energy is converted to chemical energy in the form of glucose. So it's going to look at the rate of respiration, the rate of photosynthesis in the rainforest plants versus the pine forest plants. So we're going to look at the different locations. So we know Puerto Rico is an island in the Caribbean. It's off the coast of America, and it's largely rainforest vegetation. Now when we look at the pine forest, well, we know this is in England, so we know the climate's going to be very different. So we can start to look at these different effects, different environmental effects on the rate of photosynthesis. So let's have a look at the answer then. So why is the GPP in the rainforest in Puerto Rico much greater than the GPP of the pine forest trees in England? Well, in Puerto Rico, we know there's going to be a much higher light intensity. So the higher the light intensity, the higher the rate of photosynthesis, and therefore the more chemical energy fixed in the form of glucose. We also know because Puerto Rico is near the equator, the temperatures are going to be much higher. So higher temperatures means higher rates of enzyme controlled reactions. Because there's more kinetic energy of the enzyme and the substrate, we get more successful collisions, therefore we get more products. Now, because photosynthesis involves a number of different enzyme reactions, then we're going to get more glucose being synthesized at these slightly higher temperatures. Now, we also know higher rainfall in the tropics, tropical rainforest, and we know H2O is needed for photosynthesis. So we've got higher light intensity, we've got higher temperatures, and we've got higher rainfall. Higher light intensity means more light energy available to be fixed into chemical energy. Higher temperatures, more kinetic energy, more higher rate of reaction to make glucose. And higher rainfall provides more water for photosynthesis. So the rate of photosynthesis in the tropics is very much greater than the rate of photosynthesis in the pine forest trees in England. Also in Puerto Rico, we know because it is near the equator, there's much fewer seasonal variation in these different factors. So we know light intensity, temperatures, rainfall, etc. tends to stay relatively constant throughout the year. So photosynthesis in the rainforest is going to continue all year round. Now we know the pine forest in England, most photosynthesis will take place predominantly in the summer months when there's greater light intensity and slightly warmer temperatures. Now we also know the conifer trees in the pine forest in England, well, the leaves are kind of needle shaped, and that's because these conifer trees do not want to lose too much water, especially during the winter months. Because obviously they can't absorb a lot of the water because it's frozen in the soil. So they want to prevent transpiration in the winter so they can retain some of that water within the plant itself. Now we know if there's reduced leaves in the form of these kind of pine needles, then they're not going to be able to photosynthesize as effectively as the leaves as part of the rainforest. So the pine trees have narrow needle-like leaves, so they're not going to be able to absorb as much light energy as the bigger, broader, flatter leaves in the rainforest, and so the rate of photosynthesis is less. Now we also know, the last point here at the bottom, that the tropical rainforest are going to have a greater density of plants in a smaller area. So if we took an equivalent area, for example, and compared the number of plants, we'd actually find more in the rainforest. So there's a greater density of plants compared to the density of plants in the same area in the pine forest in England. Now the next question, question D, it says, suggest why the NPP of the alfalfa field, so these are actually crops, the legume plants, alfalfa is a legume crop that's grown in large fields in America. Why would the NPP be greater than that of the rainforest? So let's have a look at the answers. So again, we've got to think of the type of plants and the environment. Well, alfalfa plants we know are young growing plants. So of the carbon they fix to make glucose by photosynthesis, a lot of this organic material, the glucose is used to make amino acids and fatty acids, etc. So proteins can be made, lipids can be made, phospholipids can be made. A lot of this organic material is going to be used as biomass to make new cells. So of the organic matter that's made from photosynthesis, a lot of that is used to make new matter, cells and tissues. Some of it, of course, will be respired, but most of it is going to go to making new cells and tissues to allow rapid growth of these young crop plants. Now, in the rainforest, because these trees are mostly mature, so in the table we can see at the top it says mature rainforest, there's actually not going to be that much growth because they've already matured. So a lot of the glucose that is made is actually going to be respired. Now we also have to remember in these big mature rainforest trees, not all parts of the tree can photosynthesize. So for example, the cells that make up the trunk of the tree, the bark of the tree, the root system of the tree, they can't photosynthesize, but they still have to respire. So a lot of the glucose that's made in photosynthesis is going to be used in cellular respiration in parts of the plant that can't make their own glucose. So a lot more of the glucose that's made at the leaves is going to get used up in respiration in these mature trees compared to the young growing alfalfa plants. Now most of this plant is predominantly leaf organs, or made up of many leaves, because that allows more photosynthesis and therefore a lot more glucose to be made in respect to the size of the plant. Now the other key point is obviously we've just talked about the rate of respiration being greater compared to the rate of photosynthesis in the mature rainforest trees. So that means obviously that NPP will be lower in the mature rainforest trees because there's more respiration compared to photosynthesis. Now the alfalfa, because it is a legume crop, we know it's got rhizobia bacteria in the root nodules on the root system. Now because these rhizobia can fix atmospheric nitrogen into ammonia, that ammonia is given to the legume plant and it's used to make what we call organic nitrogen. So because of this symbiotic relationship the legume plant has with the rhizobia bacteria, the legume plant can get more organic nitrogen molecules made because it's got the nitrogen from the ammonia. It can make DNA, RNA, which are nucleic acids. It can make amino acids that are used to make proteins. It can make ATP because that contains nitrogen, and it can also make chlorophyll because that also contains nitrogen. So we know that's going to allow for greater rates of growth in the legume plant because of that fixation of atmospheric nitrogen gas that's used to make these organic nitrogen molecules. So if you wish to test yourself on these definitions and equations that we talked about, just pause the video and have a quick go at this little activity. So I'll give you a little bit of time there. Now, if we look at number 1, photosynthetic efficiency, well, if we match that up correctly, it should have been D. So we know photosynthetic efficiency is an equation, and it's the energy, the light energy incorporated into photosynthetates divided by the total light energy that falls on the plant, because we know not all of the light energy is utilized in photosynthesis for several reasons, and we're actually going to times that by 100 to give us a percentage. Now the gross primary productivity we know is C, and that's the rate of conversion of the light energy into chemical energy in the form of glucose or other photosynthates that are made from the glucose before taking into account any glucose used up in respiration. Now the net primary productivity is quite simply the GPP minus the glucose used up in respiration, and we know some of that energy is going to be lost to the environment as heat energy. So this NPP represents the potential food available, the biomass available to the primary consumer. Now secondary productivity is the rate at which the consumers accumulate chemical energy in the form of organic molecules that make up the cells and tissues of that organism. And gross ecological efficiency, this is about the energy transfer between the different trophic levels in a food chain. So we know it's the energy in one trophic level divided by the total energy in the previous trophic level of that food chain times 100, because again it's a percentage. So this gross ecological efficiency talks about the efficiency of energy transfer between trophic levels within a food chain or a food web. So we need to be able to distinguish between pyramids of numbers and pyramids of biomass. So these two pictures, they represent on the left hand side here actually a pyramid of numbers, and this is basically within a defined area the numbers of organisms that represent each trophic level. So we know the oak tree is our producer, and that's going to have GPP, which is basically all the chemical energy from photosynthesis. Now we know NPP is the biomass available to the next trophic level, so it's the NPP that's available to the caterpillar. Now we know one oak tree will sustain many thousands of caterpillars potentially, so when we actually count the numbers, this rectangle at the bottom here is only quite thin because there's only a single oak tree, but that can sustain many caterpillars. So the numbers of caterpillars we might want to put as 1,000 So the numbers are much, much higher. Now we know the blue tits are going to feed off the caterpillar. So the caterpillar is a primary consumer, which makes the blue tit a secondary consumer. So the secondary productivity in the caterpillar is now the biomass is available to the blue tit, and this will sustain a smaller number of blue tits in comparison to the number of caterpillars that feed off the oak tree. So we can see as we go up the food chain, the numbers in each trophic level do become smaller. And we know the sparrowhawk at the top must be the tertiary consumer. Now, when we look at the right-hand side and the pyramids of biomass, this is slightly different. So we can see the first trophic level, the oak tree, the rectangle here is much bigger compared to the pyramid of numbers. So even though we still have a single oak tree that will sustain many hundreds or if not thousands of caterpillars, when we take the dry mass of this oak tree in a defined area, the dry mass of the oak tree is going to be much, much greater than the dry mass of all the caterpillars collectively in the same area. So the rectangle we're going to draw for the trophic level of the primary consumer, the caterpillar, is going to be smaller than the dry mass of the single oak tree that sustains all these caterpillars. And as we go up the food chain from caterpillar to blue tit, so primary to secondary consumer, we know there's going to be fewer blue tits compared to caterpillars, but when we do the dry mass of the blue tits versus the caterpillars, there's a smaller dry mass. And it's the same for the sparrowhawks as well. So here we get a rectangle at the bottom representing the dry mass of the oak tree, and then the dry mass gets smaller as we progress up the food chain. So if we look at the left-hand column, we can see pyramids of numbers. So these are really defined by the number of individuals per meter squared, or the individuals per meter cubed, which is the volume. And we're going to count the numbers in each trophic level in this defined area or volume. So we can see here, number one, we know there's many more grass organisms compared to rabbits that feed off the grass in the same area, and there's less foxes that feed off the rabbits in the next trophic level. So we can see here there's a typical pyramid of numbers. Now the example we've just seen was the single oak tree, and that will sustain many, many aphids, and we know ladybirds are insects that feed off aphids. So this is the pyramid of numbers that looks slightly skewed because of that large producer organism, and there's only one of them. Now we can get a different pyramid of numbers here at the bottom that looks slightly different. So this is an aquatic food chain. Now phytoplankton, just put number 3 here, phytoplankton are algae that sit on the top of the seas, the oceans, and they can photosynthesize. So photosynthesize, and they make NPP, which is then available to the next trophic level, which are the zooplankton. And zooplankton are really microscopic animals that feed off the algae, the phytoplankton. So quite often there's actually a greater number of zooplankton in a specified area or volume compared to the numbers of producers that will fix and make the organic material that the zooplankton feed off. Now the next trophic level here is the fish that feed off the small microscopic animals, the zooplankton, and so there's going to be fewer numbers in this case compared to these primary consumers, the zooplankton. So pyramid numbers then, it's the raw numbers of organisms in each trophic level per defined area or volume. Now the next type of pyramid is called the pyramid of biomass. So this is really the amount of dry organic matter at each trophic level within a defined unit of area or volume. So we can see if we just go here, we'll look at this number 2 and number 3 at the bottom. This is a typical period of biomass. So we can see the first producer trophic level normally has a greater biomass, and it's the NPP that's being made available to the next trophic level, which will then sustain the next trophic level number 3. Now on the right hand side we've got a pyramid of energy, So this is really the quantity of energy that's transferred from one trophic level to another trophic level in the food chain per unit area or unit volume. So we've seen this before as gross ecological efficiency. So gross ecological efficiency. So this is actually the transfer of energy from one trophic level to the next to the next. Now this is actually really beneficial because we know whenever we get a food chain, there's always going to be a loss of energy between the different trophic levels, and that's normally why we only get 5 trophic levels maximum. Sometimes it's a bit longer if it's an aquatic ecosystem, because of that loss of energy at each trophic level. And the loss of energy can be through glucose used up by the organisms in respiration, so some of the energy gets lost in the environment as heat. We know excreted molecules and egested molecules can be, or material can be decomposed, and we know dead organisms also get decomposed. Now, one of the benefits of using the pyramids of energy on the right hand side here, so these pyramids of energy, is that they never get inverted. So the first producer trophic level will always have the biggest rectangle on the bottom, and the next trophic level, the primary consumer, will have a smaller rectangle, because we know energy is lost. So we're going to put here energy is lost at each trophic level, and this is a pyramid of energy. Now the advantage is that we can take any ecosystem and look at a particular food chain, and then we can start to compare the efficiency of energy transfer along that food chain for the different environments, because we know that they're never inverted and they're always going to have the largest rectangle as the producer at the bottom of the pyramid of energy. So it allows us to compare directly different food chains and see the efficiency of energy transfer. So just to reiterate the point we've just made, how is energy lost at each trophic level in a pyramid of energy? Because we know each level gets smaller as we go up the pyramid. Well, we know energy is lost through heat due to respiration. That's cellular respiration that involves the breakdown of glucose. We know energy is lost in excretion, so molecules like urea get released as urine. We know feces is the egested material like fiber and cellulose that can't be digested. And we know decomposition of dead organisms take place by saprophytic decomposers. Now, why can a pyramid of energy never be inverted? So one of the benefits is that they aren't inverted, and we can compare them directly between different food chains. And that's because energy is always lost from one trophic level to the next. Now, it's normally about 10%. We know if this is a terrestrial ecosystem with a terrestrial food chain, that can be slightly lower, so anywhere between sort of 1 and 3%. And we know if it's an aquatic ecosystem where we've got ectothermic animals, that can be always slightly higher, up to maybe even 40% energy transfer. And we also know energy cannot be produced. No organism can just make energy from nothing. It has to originate either from sunlight and fixed in the form of chemical energy and photosynthesis, so that those autotrophs will be able to photosynthesize, or through chemosynthesis, which is the second type of autotrophic nutrition. So energy is not produced, it's only transferred or converted from one form to another. So 2 questions we quite often see in the exams is what aspect of a pyramid of energy overcomes the problems that we might associate with pyramids of numbers and pyramids of biomass. Well, we know pyramids of energy, their advantage is they're never inverted, and that means you can actually compare these pyramids of energy from different food chains and different ecosystems and compare the values directly. Now, a disadvantage of using pyramids of energy is that they're actually much more difficult to construct compared to a pyramid of numbers or a pyramid of biomass. So the easiest pyramid to construct is that of pyramid of numbers, because you quite simply have to count the number of organisms in that trophic level in a defined area or volume. Now, a pyramid of biomass is probably slightly more difficult than a pyramid of numbers to construct, because you have to measure the dry mass of the organisms in a defined area or volume. Now for the pyramids of energy, you have to measure the growth rate of individual organisms over time, so how much they grow individually, and also the reproduction rate, so the formation of new individuals over time. So pyramids of energy are actually more difficult to construct than the other two types of pyramids, the numbers and the biomass.